Hey everyone, my name is Forrest with Rocky Mountain School of Photography, and today we're going to do my ultimate setup guide of the Insta360 ONE RS with the 4K boost lens. Let's go ahead and dive in. One more thing before we get into this video, I am actually giving away our older Insta360 ONE R at the end of this video. So you guys should keep watching to learn all the details on how to enter the giveaway. It's super free to enter, and if you want to win this wonderful camera that probably has like 5 hours of use on it, very lightly used, pretty much mint condition, I'd love to give it to one of you. So stay tuned to the end of the video to learn more about the giveaway. First and foremost, this is not going to be a quick tips video. The goal of this video is going to be to teach you the inner workings of this camera and help you make the best decision on the best settings in your given situation. I always have people asking me, hey, what's the best setting for this situation or this situation or this situation? And I'm not just going to be feeding you settings in this video. Instead, I want to help you understand why we set the things that we set so that you can get the best footage possible out of this camera. It also needs to be said that there are different lenses for the Insta360. So I'm focusing on the 4K boost lens today. There's also the 1-inch lens as well as the 360 lens, and they each have their own options and they each have kind of a way of working. I picked the 4K boost today because it's the most similar to the GoPro Hero 10, and I think it's the one that most people should start with depending on the situation. Lastly, in the full interest of transparency, I want to say that Insta360 did provide this camera to me for the purposes of this tutorial. However, since this isn't a review by any stretch of the imagination, I think that's totally fine. Also, they didn't pay me anything. They just gave me the camera to demo on today. To make this video a little bit easier to navigate through, I'm breaking it into kind of 3 sections. We have general settings, we're gonna do video settings, and then lastly, we're gonna do photo settings. So let's start with general. General settings, to get into those, we're gonna go ahead and turn on the camera, and then we're gonna swipe down from the top of the screen. As soon as we swipe down from the top, Insta360 is gonna give us a series of little menu options. Now, some of these are a little gimmicky, but I want to go over them. The first one, upper left, is screen brightness. Real simple there. We can set how bright or how dark we want the screen to be. I always leave mine on the full brightness. This next setting over is a touchscreen lock. Those of you who've used a touchscreen underwater, you'll know that the water touches the screen and the screen thinks that it's being interacted with, and it can change all kinds of wacky settings on your camera. So before you use this camera underwater, simply tap that button right there, and that will lock the touchscreen. In order to unlock it, what you'll do is you'll tap the screen and swipe up to the top right there, and that will unlock it and it will return to normal use. This third option here is our hyper smooth stabilization. Actually, that's GoPro's name for it. I shouldn't say hyper smooth. I should use Insta360's, which I think is, what is Insta360's stabilization? Flow state. This third button is your flow state stabilization level. It basically determines how much image stabilization is going to go into your footage. Now, the only disadvantage real here of putting it on high stabilization is that there's going to be a little bit of delay between what you're imaging and what the screen is showing you, because basically the processor on the camera has to catch up. Really, really simple. I'm gonna leave this on standard most of the time. The only exceptions to that is if I'm gonna do something very extreme, say mounting this camera to a dirt bike and going on a dirt path, I'm gonna increase that case my stabilization to high because there's gonna be a lot of bouncing on the camera. Contrary to that, if I'm gonna use this camera on a tripod, much like what I'm doing right now, say for YouTube videos, in that case, we can put that stabilization down to low. This third option is a tally light or a indicator light. All it does is it turns on and off a light on the front of the Insta360 that indicates when it's recording. I love this option in every instance unless you are recording something that's reflective. If you're taking a video of something reflective and you have this light on, the light will reflect off of whatever you're taking video of and you'll see the light in the footage that you're capturing. In all other instances, I think it's a great thing to have on because it gives you a really nice visual indicator of when the camera is recording. If we swipe over, we can see that we have an option to turn on and off grid lines. These are purely to help you compose your footage. If you're trying to align a building vertically or align a horizon horizontally, this can help you lay that out in a way that's straight so you don't end up having to crop in post. This next one here is rotation lock. And what this can do is if you're gonna mount your camera to something that's gonna spin, the camera will actually try to correct that footage rotation to make everything look the right way up and down. And if you want the footage to show that spin, what you can do is lock the rotation, and that's gonna lock it in a given orientation. So say you're mounting it to, I don't know, you're gonna throw the camera and the camera's gonna tumble through the air. You're gonna wanna turn on rotation lock so that it keeps down, down, and up from when you throw it, so the footage actually rotates through the air. This third one is voice control. I leave that off all the time because I find that it records things and stops recording when I don't mean it to, because it just hears things that I don't say. It doesn't work the best is kind of what I'm saying. And then this 8th setting here, this is our quick capture mode. And what quick capture means, very, very simple. If quick capture is off and you want to take a new video clip or photo, you need to first turn on the camera with the on-off button on the top, and then push the record button to take a clip or a photograph. If you turn on quick capture, you don't have to hit the on-off button first. You can just hit the record button, and the camera will turn itself on and start the recording as quickly as it possibly can. It saves you a button push and maybe a half a second of time. I usually leave it off though, because if I'm gonna put this in my camera bag, that's 2 different buttons that can both turn on the camera accidentally instead of just one. Finally, if we go over to our 3rd menu, we have the gear, which is where we get into the more in-depth settings of the camera. There are really only a couple things in here that I think are worth mentioning. So once we go into the settings, the first thing that I think is worth changing is in the general settings. If we go down to sharpness, I'm gonna recommend that we put our sharpness on medium or even low. Sharpness is artificially added sharpening. It doesn't mean your lens magically gets sharper. It just applies some sharpening in post-production inside the camera's processor. And I prefer to sharpen my footage manually, give it the exact amount of sharpening that I want to give it. And I do that in Premiere, or I do that in LumaFusion, whatever program I'm using to edit. I'm going to customize the amount of sharpening that I want. I don't want the camera adding a bunch because you can't really remove sharpening, you can only add it in. So for me, I let my sharpening be on low, and then I sharpen to taste in post-production. The only reason you might want to change this is if you're looking to take your footage right off your camera and post it directly on social media, or do whatever it is you want to do with that footage. You might want to have the camera give you a little bit of added sharpness so that you don't have to do as much in post-production. The other setting that I want to talk about in the general settings, or in the settings box, is down at the bottom under the SD card option. And this option is called formatting. Now, I'm gonna go ahead and do this to my memory card right now, but I want you guys to wait and not follow along. So I'm gonna hit Format SD card and I'm gonna say confirm. But I wanna point out right here, it says all files on the SD card will be deleted after formatting. Are you sure you wish to format? And I am. I'm gonna hit confirm, but I wanna make that very clear. First and foremost, formatting a memory card deletes all of the footage on the card. So do not format unless you have all of your footage on your computer or your phone or somewhere safe. If you format and you don't have your footage safe, that footage will be gone. So why do we do it? Well, formatting is one of the best things you can do to make your memory card last a very long time. And I see so many corrupted memory cards through the years with people who don't routinely format them. Cards like to be formatted in the camera you're going to use them with, and so for me, I'm in a habit of always formatting a card as soon as I put it into a new camera. Sharing cards between cameras is also not recommended. So you don't really want to take a card out of the Insta360 and pop it into your drone without formatting it first in the drone, because that's where you're going to shoot footage in. So I like to have obviously more than enough memory cards, and whenever I put a fresh memory card into a camera, assuming that that footage has been backed up, I always start by formatting it. And you all, there are some other settings inside the camera, especially under that little gear, but most of those are pretty like little tweaks, you could say. If you change the sharpness and you get used to routinely formatting your memory card, that's really the only reason you're gonna need to go into that in-depth menu system. So let's go ahead and get into our video settings. What are the main things we need to know with video? Well, video, the biggest decision of all that you have to make is the decision of what resolution and what frame rate you're going to use, because those really influence what type of footage is going to come out of the camera. Let's look at how we change that. So first of all, I'm gonna make sure that I'm in video mode. So I'm gonna tap in the lower left here, and we can see that I'm in mode 7 of 13, which is video mode. I also want to point out that new to this camera is an HDR video mode, which basically gives you more what's called dynamic range, which is details in your highlights and details in your shadows, but less configuration options. So a quick note, for those of you who want to learn the least, say you want to just let the camera do as many things on auto as possible, for you folks, I would recommend shooting on the active HDR mode because it's gonna do a lot of really cool processing to get you really good footage right out of the camera. With that said, in the trained hands of someone who understands this camera, you will be able to get the same or better results with using the standard video mode. So for me, that's what I'm gonna focus on today. I'm gonna pick standard video. Now, resolution and frame rate, if I click down here or tap down here at the bottom, it's gonna let me pick my resolution on the top here and my frame rate on the bottom. So what is this? Well, resolution is simply a measure of how many pixels across and down, basically how many pixels are in your video clip. How detailed is it? Think about if you zoom in really, really far on a video clip, you could count the individual square pixels, and the higher the resolution, the more of those pixels you have. So 4K on the 4K boost lens is the highest resolution we can shoot. We could also opt to go down to 2.7K or even down to 1080p. The measurement system here is the number of pixels across, except for 1080 because they're kind of weird. They do weird things. They count things strangely. Just know 1080 is the lowest resolution and 4K would be the highest resolution. So why do we need more resolution? Well, very, very simply, the higher your resolution, the more pixels you have to work with. Well, why do you need more pixels? Well, there's a couple reasons. For one, you might want to upload your video to, say, YouTube, and you want to upload it in 4K resolution. You guys can look, this video was uploaded in 4K, and if you look down in there in the corner and you change the resolution of this video, you can see you can play this video back that you're watching right now in 4K or in 1080p or in a myriad of other lower resolutions. And you'll notice that the 4K version looks the sharpest, it looks the crispest. So if you want to upload to YouTube in 4K, you're going to need to shoot 4K footage out of the camera. So you can simply tap there, you can tap at the bottom, and we can set it to 4K. Another advantage of shooting a higher resolution is that you can punch in. Let me show you guys what that means. Let's go ahead and punch in right now, and then we'll punch back out right now. Because we shoot a higher resolution, we have a little bit of room to zoom in and zoom out in the footage. And the higher resolution you shoot, the more room, the more ability you have to zoom in and zoom out in post-production. Long story short, I would recommend shooting 4K pretty much all the time. The only time I would lower that resolution is for one of two things. First, if you need a higher frame rate. We'll talk about that here in a second. And the second would be if you're really tight on memory card space. Say you're on a trip, you're in the middle of nowhere, and you are looking at your footage left on your card, and you're like, ooh, my memory card's pretty full. You might want to reduce down to 1080p to make sure that you can fit more footage on the card. So the obvious question is, why would you use a lower resolution if a higher resolution gives you all that extra stuff? And the truth of the matter is, I don't really know. Some cameras, like the GoPro Hero 10, if you lower your resolution, it unlocks a higher frame rate. And higher frame rates can be useful for doing more slow motion things, stuff like that. But on this camera, regardless of what resolution you choose, the maximum frame rate is 60 frames per second. So I guess I would say this. The only time I would reduce my resolution would be in instances where I need to fit more information on the memory card. Say you're somewhere in the middle of nowhere, there's no access to buy more memory cards, and you know you're there for a week and you need to fit as much as possible on the card, then I would step down to 2.7K or even 1080p. I guess also if you had a slower computer or an older phone that struggled processing the 4K resolution clips, you might consider stepping it down at that as well. And that brings us to frame rate. Frame rates are fairly straightforward. Frame rate is just how many still frames per second goes into your video clip. You may not know this, but video is just a series of still images all strung together one after the next. So the video you all are watching right now, this is 30 frames per second. You're actually seeing 30 still images per second in front of your face, and we perceive that as video, as motion. Well, very simply, the more frames per second you shoot, the slower you can play back that footage without things looking like this and getting a bunch of weird, like jittery movements. So if you're doing something pretty cool, you're recording something that has a lot of fast action to it, I would highly recommend shooting at 60 frames per second in those instances, because that's going to give you an ability to do slow motion, to in post-production, slow-mo your footage. The other side of that is if you're shooting something that you know you're never going to need to do slow-mo on. Say you're using the Insta360 to record a YouTube video. You might want to go down instead to 30 frames per second or even 24 frames per second, because the lower your frame rate, the more smooth your motion looks. As I wave my hands about like this, there's a bit of motion blur that's happening because my hands are moving so quickly that there's a little bit of blur as my hands move through the air. And that looks natural. It's what our eyes see. It's how we interact with the world. So my recommendation is, if you're shooting something that's fast action, say you're mountain biking down a hill with the Insta360, and you know you might want to do slow-mo sometime, I would shoot at 60 frames per second or whatever the highest frame rate you have available to you is. On the flip side, if you're using this camera to record YouTube videos, I would recommend 30 frames per second or 24 frames per second, because those will give you the most natural looking motion and motion blur in your clips. If you want to learn more about this whole motion blur thing, I'll put a card up there in the corner for you guys to watch my video on using neutral density filters with action cameras. It talks a lot about how to get more performance out of an action camera like this if you're going to use it for more traditional YouTube style videos. So definitely check that out if you're planning on using this camera for YouTube stuff, for like talking head tutorials or vlogging or something like that, and not necessarily like strapping it to your head and jumping out of an airplane. All right, so enough about that. From there, we have some more in-depth settings. And if we can get to that by swiping over from the right-hand side into the center, and you'll notice at the very top, we can choose here between auto mode or manual mode. Now, I recommend pretty much everybody starts on auto mode. Auto is going to do a really great job in a lot of instances for you. With that said, there are some nice things that we can change even on automatic mode. And again, if you want to learn more about using your camera on manual mode, check out that video I talked about earlier. When you start getting into manual mode on a camera like this, you also need to start using things like neutral density filters and extra equipment to make it all work. But if we are going to shoot on auto, a couple options we still have is, for one, our color mode. You guys can see there's vivid, standard, and log. Now, this is very simple. I'm going to leave mine on standard most of the time. However, if I want to start getting into color grading and using presets and exploring lookup tables and really coloring my footage in an interesting and compelling way, I'm actually going to shoot on log mode. Log mode is a color mode that does not have very much saturation, it does not have very much contrast, and it is built for people who want to add saturation and contrast in post-production. So, very clearly, your log mode footage will look terrible right out of the camera. You have to make it look good in post-production, but in the hands of a skilled editor, you can make log footage look way better after post-production than you can with standard or vivid footage. If you're looking to take your footage, take it right out of the camera, post it on Instagram. In that case, I would go with standard or vivid. If you want to do some post-production, I would go with log. All right, we can't choose our shutter speed because we're shooting auto. That's totally fine. We can't choose our ISO because we're shooting auto. Those are some great things to explore if you guys want to get into ND filters, things like that. The last thing, or one of the last things we can control on auto mode, is our EV. This is exposure value or exposure compensation. And all this is sometimes the camera meter, which decides how bright or dark the footage should be, gets a little bit confused. And this is a way to override it and basically tell the camera to record brighter or darker than it thinks is proper. The only way to know this and to work with this is to experiment and look at the screen on the back or on your phone and see what looks better. There are some instances, say you were mountain biking through a dark forest with a bright sky overhead. In situations like that, you might need to put some positive plus EV values in order to brighten up your footage a little bit, because that bright sky is going to confuse the camera and the camera might end up on automatic mode shooting footage that's too dark. Those of you who have been into photography for a while, we have a whole series of videos on this. This is called exposure compensation or outsmarting the meter. In simple terms, look at the screen on the back. If the footage looks too bright, go ahead and dial this EV down a little bit. If this footage looks too dark, go ahead and dial the EV up. Most of the time, 0 will work fine. The last kind of auto option that we have available to us is our white balance. And white balance is a measure of how blue or yellow our footage is. In the vast majority of instances, the auto mode is going to work great here. Really, the only exception to that is if you're trying to convey a certain mood or feeling with your imagery. Let me explain. Human beings are accustomed to seeing bluer photos. We call that cool in the photo industry, cooler imagery, as a little bit more cold and dark, and has a certain feeling or vibe associated with it. I'll throw a blue cast over myself, a slight blue cast over myself, to look at this right now. When you guys are watching this video right now, it feels cold. It actually feels kind of darker when you look at that footage just by adding a little bit of blue. The opposite of that is if you make your footage a little bit warmer, it has a very bright, cheerful vibe. And we're not talking high key and low key. We're just talking kind of like literal warmer or cooler, depending on the blue or yellow color cast. Well, white balance is what gives us that control. Auto is going to do its best to just make things look good. The problem is generally looking proper in the world of white balance is the least creatively exciting. So you can totally do this in post-production as well. But if you want to do it in camera, all we've got to do is swipe over and then here, go down to the bottom, go to WB, and now we can customize. The lower numbers like 2000K, 2200K, those are going to be a much bluer video. And you can see this in real time as I adjust it. And if we keep going up, the footage is going to get warmer and warmer and warmer, or yellower and yellower and yellower and yellower, all the way up till we get to, I think, 10,000K. And at 10,000K, the footage is very warm. It has that very inviting vibe to it. Now, different lights also have different color casts. So this light that we're shooting under right now has a color cast of 5600K. So technically, if I wanted to make the footage look proper under this light, I would put it at 5500K, the closest option I have. And now footage that I shoot in this video studio, because it's lit with a 5600 Kelvin light source, the whites are going to look white and things are going to look proper. The only other option when you might want to set your white balance manually would be in instances where you're going to be changing from one lighting condition to another over the course of one video clip. And if that's the case, you might want to set your white balance at one specific point, maybe the halfway point between what one light source looks good at and what another light source looks good at. And that way the camera is not changing color like it will on auto mode as you change from one light source to another. Generally though, for me, I'm gonna leave that WB selector on auto, or if I know the Kelvin temperature, the K value of the light I'm shooting under, like in this room, I would set it to that number there. And with that, we're set. Those are our video settings. Now, this camera also, if we tap this Q button up here, gives us an option to save different presets. So if you're interested in having maybe one preset set up at 4K 60 frames per second for faster shooting, stuff that you want to use maybe slow motion on, and maybe another preset for 4K at 24 frames per second, say more YouTube vlog style stuff, you can totally set that up in here. Also, you can tap this button down here and you can actually zoom in your footage. Now, it needs to be said, this is a digital zoom. So you can do this same zoom in post-production if you want to, just using Premiere or LumaFusion, but it's kind of nice. It actually gives you the option and it shows you the focal length there down at the bottom. So you can see by default, this is a 17mm equivalent lens, and we can zoom it all the way into a 50, which is pretty awesome to have that ability. So that's this button right here with the little plus magnifying glass, and then the Q is to set up our different presets. Also, lastly, you can see battery life up here at the top, and we can see how much footage we have left on the card, assuming the current settings. So if you increase your resolution or decrease your resolution, that number in the upper left is going to change to reflect how much footage is left at your current setup. All right, let's do photo settings. So I'm gonna go ahead and tap down there at the bottom on the video mode. We're gonna go over to photo mode and select that. Now, photo mode is very similar to video mode. I'm gonna recommend that you leave quite a few things on auto mode unless you really wanna start getting into it. And that's where watching our basic exposure tutorial, which I'll link down in the description, things like that can help you start to get a handle on this. These cameras are incredibly capable photo cameras. They do a really great job. In fact, this camera can actually shoot 48 megapixel still photos. It's pretty cool. But especially in the photo world, knowing the settings really lets you unlock extra bonus features. And if you understand general photo exposure settings on a DSLR or mirrorless camera, you can understand them here. So again, I'll link that down in the description if you guys want to watch our basic exposure tutorial. That will walk through how f-stops, shutter speeds, ISOs work, and that's easily translatable over to this camera. For now, what I'm gonna do is just like with video, I'm gonna tap down here at the bottom and we need to pick what resolution we wanna shoot at. Now, like I said, this camera can shoot 48 megapixels, which is pretty sweet. And I was a little bit dubious of whether the 48 megapixel mode would look really good, and it actually looks pretty awesome. So I think that's really advisable. The only reason I might step down to a lower resolution, like say 12 megapixels, would be in situations where I needed to fit more photos on the memory card. But again, photos take up such little space, it's not a huge deal. So I'm gonna leave mine on 48 megapixels most of the time. If you don't need all 48 megapixels, well, then don't use them, just crop or don't make as big of a print. At least you have them to start with, which is a pretty cool thing. This line down here, this is for your self timer. If you're taking a group photo and you wanna set the camera up on a tripod, push the button and have it count down from 10 seconds before it takes the picture. That's how we set this down here. If you're just taking pictures, leave that on off. From there, we're gonna swipe in from the right-hand side, and we're gonna put the camera on auto mode. Now, again, just like with video settings, even on auto mode, there are a few things that we have control over. First and foremost is our quality or our format, what type of images we wanna shoot. And you guys can see there's JPEG, JPEG plus RAW, and what's called Pure Shot. So Pure Shot is Insta360's AI algorithmic raw magic processing secret sauce recipe thing. I'm not a huge fan of it. For me personally, I leave my camera on JPEG plus RAW. RAW and JPEG, it could be a whole video on its own. Basically, JPEG files are lower resolution, more processed, you're giving the camera more control files, whereas raw images are images right off the memory card. In fact, I think I'll make a video on that down the line. That's a good video topic to talk about. But the takeaway is raw files will look worse out of the camera, but they'll have more ability to be edited in post-production. Much like with video, we talked about the color modes, and I talked about vivid, standard, and log. Log looks worse out of camera, just like raw looks worse out of camera. But if you edit a raw photo or you edit a logarithmic piece of video footage, you can make it better than what the JPEG will look out of camera. So it depends on whether you want to do stuff in editing. If you have no interest in doing any editing in post-production, I would set my camera to JPEG only. If you're interested in post, I would go to JPEG plus RAW. Shutter speed's gonna be auto, but again, I would recommend you guys learn about shutter speed, get used to it as you start to get more familiar with this camera. That's how you can do slow shutter speeds and get like blurry, beautiful, pillowy water. It's how you can show motion blur. There's a lot of cool features and kind of effects you can create by adjusting your shutter speed. ISO as well, I'm gonna leave that on auto for now, but it's something to learn. EV, just like EV with video. If your footage or your photos look a little bit too bright or too dark, you can adjust the EV value down or up to brighten or darken the photos before you take them first. You can also do it in post, but it's better to do it in camera if you can. And then we also have white balance, same as we do with video. So same things apply. So a lot of similarities here. Really the only difference is the JPEG and RAW versus standard/vivid or the logarithmic mode in the video world. And you all, that's it. We also have the ability to zoom in and out in photo mode, as well as set up custom modes. So if you want to have a custom mode that's full auto and a custom mode that's full manual, there's all kinds of ways we can customize this. And you guys, let's see, we're at about 40 minutes of raw record time. Who knows how long this video will be once it's edited down, but that is how you set up this camera. Now, there are some things, obviously, that we didn't get fully into. We didn't talk about manual video settings, manual photo settings, and that's because For most people, there's no need to get into that stuff. And I'm gonna link some kind of resources down in the description for you guys to check out. If you are interested in learning a little bit more about manual video or manual photo and how to unlock every capability of a camera like this, or if you want to know more about the 360 lens or the 1-inch lens, definitely let me know in the comments section down below. I would appreciate it. All right, and like I said at the beginning of the video, we are giving away an Insta360 ONE R to one of you guys. So how do you enter? Well, super easy. All you got to do is like this video, leave a comment down below, and make sure you're subscribed to our channel. On May 13th, I will randomly pick one of the commenters down below, and I will ask you to send me an email with your address, and we'll go ahead and go from there. I will not use another account to comment back on your comment. So if any other account other than Rocky Mountain School of Photography tells you you won, don't believe them. It will come from our channel and our channel only. So May 13th, check that out. I will give you a limited amount of time if you win to get back to me in the comments section. So make sure that you check or you have notifications turned on so that when I reply to your comment, you're able to see that in a timely manner before I have to move on to the next person. If you don't want to enter the giveaway or the giveaway time has already passed, I would still love you guys to hit the like button, drop a comment down below if you have a question or a future video idea, and hit subscribe as well as the bell icon to stay up to date with future videos. Thanks everybody, I appreciate it, and I'll catch you in the next one.